Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 writehive Conference. My name is Hing Wen, and I'm thrilled to moderate for you today. Today, we are joined by a wonderful panel of writers, including Alverne Ball, Bobby Nash, and Don Vogel, to discuss the topic of breadcrumbing clues in mystery novels. Breadcrumbs can make or break a mystery, and our panelists today will be discussing all the ins and outs of that process with us today. To start, I'll introduce myself, and then I'd like to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their work. Again, my name is Hing Wen. I'm a writer of speculative fiction. I'm wearing a black shirt and have long black hair, and I will kick it off and have Alverne go ahead and introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Alverne Ball. I am a mystery writer, of course. And I'm wearing actually a black shirt with blue writing on it. And what else? And I have an MFA in creative writing from Columbia College, Chicago.
Sure. Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I write a bunch of different genres, but I do a lot of mystery work. Today I'm wearing a gray shirt, which matches my gray hair. So I guess I work at work. Color coordinated without planning.
And I'm Dawn Vogel, she, her pronouns. I am wearing glasses, purple headphones, and a very dark burgundy shirt that kind of almost looks black in this light. I'm an editor and author of speculative fiction of many different lengths, but usually my longer works tend to be mysteries. It's just what I like to write them as.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. So, to maybe take it down to the basics and defining what breadcrumbing is to our audience, how do you define breadcrumbing?
Because I've never used the term before. We started talking about this and planning it. But it's leaving clues. It's seeding your story with clues that help the reader try to solve the mystery as well. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I personally love it when I give my readers the chance to solve it. As a reader, I hate reading a book where the clue that leads our protagonist to solving the problem is one that we didn't get. So I make an effort to, if there's an important clue, it's in the book. I want to, I'm thrilled when the readers go, "Oh, I figured it out," or they get to the end and go, "That's what that meant." So you're seeding it with all of these clues that point them in the direction, but you're also seeding it with red herrings and misdirection and things that are still important but don't lead. So there's a lot of different types of breadcrumbs you can leave. You can leave the good ones, the stale ones to keep it in the bread, the bread dynamic going. You can leave some stale bread crews to try to send them in the wrong direction. But yeah, it's coming up with all of those things that are just important to solving whatever the mystery is you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I like the idea of what you just said about seeding. I think I might use that instead of breadcrumbing going forward. I just like the idea that now I'm thinking about, I'm like, we're planting seeds, and that's what you're doing. You're planting all these seeds in the hopes that, again, they will grow agriculturally if we're keeping it within the idea of wheat and yeast and all those things. But I think breadcrumbing is that you hit it on the head. It's the Hansel and Gretel of them, you leaving this trail for your readers to follow, and in hopes that they one possibly will solve the mystery before you solve it, but also hoping that they don't get it until the bitter end. So you can go, I got you. I laid all these crumbs and you still didn't see it. And most of the time, I think when as writers, when we're breadcrumbing, we don't even think about it. I think it's something that it just happens. And when it does happen, it's more of your characters that are breadcrumbing. And then you're like following along with that character and the reader at the same time.
They get those great, "Oh, that's what that meant" moment. I love those.
Yeah, I agree with what Bobby and Alvern said. And yeah, my favorite thing for breadcrumbs is sort of the ones that they don't look like anything when you first put them in. But then if you read through the whole thing, then you go, oh, that's why that was there. And those I feel like are the most satisfying breadcrumbs, the ones where the reader can then go, I see what you did there.
To address something that Bobby mentioned, which was like red herrings and misdirection, what are the types of breadcrumbs And do you personally find there being like strengths and weaknesses to the different ways of planting those clues for readers?
I think that the different ways to put them in, some people do write them in as they're writing initially. I am very much a plotter, an outliner, and so some of my breadcrumbs I plan ahead of time and write them as I'm writing through the first draft. But more often, what I do is once I get to the end of the novel, because despite being an outliner, sometimes my characters surprise me. And so when I go through for my revision passes, I like to double check where I've added these clues and these breadcrumbs and these red herrings and just make sure that it all makes sense and there's a logical progression so that the reader can follow the mystery easily and if they're paying close attention, notice those things that I stuck in there. So yeah, it's for me, I think it's some when I'm writing and then some when I'm revising, just to make sure that everything sort of fits together, almost like a puzzle. So, you might have done the edges of the puzzle first. A lot of people do, and then you fill in all the middle when you're doing the revisions.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when you're doing it, I mean, I am not an outliner, but I mean, I plot. I have a plot. It's a very loose plot when I do. So I have ideas for clues. But then what surprise or my surprises happen is the characters will give clues in dialogue a lot of times, or in something that they do that just felt right at the moment for them. And you realize, sometimes I realize later, oh, that's what that meant. So yeah, my characters are way smarter than me. Um, I had one instance. It was a short story. It was a mystery that I was writing for this anthology, and it was a short story. But it was a pretty simple plot. This is the main character. This is the problem. This is the bad guy. Here, blah, 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 blah. I am all the way at the end where the main character, the hero and the villain are face to face for the first time. And as I'm writing their dialogue, the villain says something in dialogue that made me realize he's not the bad guy. And then another character speaks up and I go, that's my bad guy, which is a much better bad guy. So I keep going. I'm like, okay, now I need to go back and make sure those clues are there. And the surprise for me was when I went back and reread it, the clues are there already. It just took me, and it took my brain a little while to piece them together. So those are those happy accidents that come from the characters telling you things.
Yeah, and I was gonna. I think Bobby hit it. I think I'm a plotter, but I think breadcrumbing usually comes. It comes in two ways. Either your characters reveal it, or as Dawn said it, you're always conscious of the clues that you're trying to leave the reader. And I think most of the time, like one of the things that I think about, like when you think of like who done it. There's always the murder weapon, always found at the beginning, of a good Agatha Christie novel, and then it's like you're going through the you're going through the motions of trying to figure out who did it, but more so why they did it. And I think that's the breadcrumbing or that clue that I think gets every reader. It's not like more about who done it, but it's more about the why. And so when we're writing unconsciously and even sometimes consciously, we're laying out these breadcrumbs of these plots or these pieces, and we're really trying to get at the who, the why something occurred, and in that why, I think is the true breadcrumbs of how things are left behind for other readers to figure out.
So both Alverne and Bobby touched on kind of your characters telling you things or revealing things to you. So I'm curious how you all kind of tackle your writing and making sure you're not giving too much away. So either through your characters or through the narrative, how you check for that.
So I usually my characters always give more away that I think, or at least I always think they do, and then I'll have somebody reading and they'll go, "Well, why did this happen?" And I'm like, "Oh, you didn't get that? You didn't get that?" They're like, back on page 5, there's this mention of something. So it's always a throwaway piece of dialogue that I think, at least for me, when I'm writing characters, there's always some throwaway dialogue that everybody's like, "Oh, it's a throwaway dialogue," and I'm like, "No, that was the most important part of the story." Because that leads you on to all these new discoveries. And most of the time, they'll be like, "Oh, I didn't. I just thought that he was talking about something." And then, what I found is that when you're writing characters, sometimes that piece of throwaway dialogue that you wrote does become the epitome of the mystery, because even as a writer, sometimes you all have a character say something, you're like, okay, that wasn't. And then, as Bobby was saying, as you get further into the story, that character may come back, or another character says something, you're going, oh my God, that's the true villain, or that's the true part of the mystery. And then you're like, oh my God, I didn't even know that existed. Now I got to go back and then, as Bobby pointed out, most of the time, unconsciously, our writers' minds have already laid those tracks, and we're just like going back and trying to make sure we hit the nail now to make sure the track stays down.
Yeah, always trust your characters. Always trust your characters because they will get you where you need to go. But also, when I know with me, when I'm writing, putting the clues and the breadcrumbs and all of that, like Alverne just said, it seems so obvious to me, but then again, I know it's a clue. The reader doesn't. But in my head, as I'm reading it, it's almost like there's a neon sign pointing at it, going, "This is a clue." So but then I'm surprised when later people didn't catch it. Or you have to go back and say, you know, people, ask you about and you say, "Oh, well, on page so and so or chapter whatever this happened," and people are like, "Oh, I missed that," or or "Oh, I thought that meant this," and so sometimes that can be both good and bad. You can surprise your readers, but then sometimes you have to be careful not to hide the clues and make them so they're not super obvious and then they miss the clues. So it's a very fine balancing act. It's not always easy.
Yeah, I think that is very true, that it is a very fine balancing act. What I tend to do in mine is to try to make some of the clues subtle and then also try to make some sort of misdirecting clues. Like, this looks like a clue, it's actually a red herring. And so, sort of, having a lot going on that is tangentially related to the plot, I think helps with that. And then, of course, the other big thing to make sure you're not giving away too much is I love beta readers because they'll read it. And then, if they're familiar with mysteries, obviously that's very important. And then say, what part of this mystery did you solve on your own? What part did you think needed more clues? And so then again, in revisions, you can sort of tweak the significance of different breadcrumbs that you've got to make the plot either more obvious or more hidden, depending on the feedback that you get.
So going off something that came out through that last question, how do you identify when your breadcrumbing isn't done well? You mentioned using beta readers. Are there any kind of methods you've been able to figure out, like, okay, this clue or this thing wasn't what I wanted it to be?
Well, certainly if I've confused myself, if if later on I'm writing something and I'm like, wait, what happened? Or how did I get here? Or did I set this up? Or if I've confused myself, there's a problem. Yeah, beta readers are wonderful. As Dawn said, that they can, because sometimes as writers we get that tunnel vision. We know what it's supposed to say. We just forgot to put all the words in there. So having someone with an objective opinion who does not know the answer. I mean, we're solving a mystery we already know the answer to. So when we sometimes take that information with us, even unconsciously, and forget to leave a clue because we already know it. So having someone who is not aware of the outcome up front read it gives you a whole different uh, point of view. And plus, not all readers are the same. You can give the same book to 10 different people, and not all of them are going to pick up clues because everyone reads these things differently. There are some readers that are their whole a big part of their goal is, I want to solve this before the protagonist does. Others are just along for the ride and are not trying to solve it. They're just reading and enjoying. So, and we kind of have to serve all of those readers in our story. So it becomes this, I think we said earlier, balancing act of, what we're putting in there. And then I think Alverne mentioned it earlier, a lot of it's gut feeling. This works because I think this works, or this works because it works for the character. Each of our characters go about solving mysteries a different way based on who that character is, their character quirks, things that they're experienced, their history. Plus, we're all different types of writers, so we all bring to the story a different history, a different background, a different reading type of books we read, a different style. And so all of that stuff we kind of have to play with, and that way, and then hopefully we just tell a story that makes sense. Really, I want it to make sense, because like I said, as a reader, I hate not being able to, when that one important clue comes out of thin air. So having to make sure, and I think that's why with mysteries, at least for me, I give them more drafts than I do, say, just a science fiction or something with no mystery to it. I spend more time because I want to make sure that the mystery can be solved.
Yeah, and building off of what Bobby said, one of the things that I know about my own writing is that I envision a lot of things and not all of it always makes it to the page. So sometimes I have to be reminded, oh, hey, you should probably take that out of your brain and actually get it on the page. And it's just, it's an oversight and it's a thing that can be fixed in revisions. And that's how I draft. But yeah, I think really that you have to kind of balance between too much hand holding or spoon feeding, if we're going along with the breadcrumb metaphor still, um, versus not enough. And so yeah, it's a very, very fine balancing act, I think, to get it right.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with everybody else. I think for me, it goes back to your gut feeling. But when you finish the draft and you're reading through it, and you already know the ending because you wrote it, and now you're going through a progression or the motions of trying to figure out as you read, you're trying to think about it in the eyes of a first reader. And you're looking at, okay, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Does all these different occurrences or all these different clues that you're leaving make sense? But you're also, I think, as you're writing that draft or rereading that draft, you're also trying to make sure that the characters make sense to the world. Because if something is off about the world or is off about the characters, then it doesn't matter how many clues you have laid. Everything else does not make sense. And so I think sometimes when we write and we're writing with these characters and these characters are talking to us, if there is a clue that makes sense for the story, but it doesn't make sense for the character, then it's like, do I cut that clue or do I leave it? And then most of the time you're going to cut it because if it doesn't ring true for the character, then it won't ring true for the reader. And that just takes you out of the story no matter what. And it could be the greatest clue, like, oh man, this is gonna expand it, make the story so much better. But it's like, but that character would never do that, or that character would never go there. And you're like, oh, now I gotta rework it or rethink it so that either that clue works, but it's gotta work for the in service of the character, which then serves the story.
One of the things that I really love to do is to have a secondary character that is helping the main character who's trying to solve the mystery. It's very much a Sherlock Holmes and Watson thing, so that you get the non-detective character able to say, but I don't understand this. And that, then benefits the reader because they've got the person saying, hey, I don't get this, even though the detective character may be like, oh yeah, no, this makes perfect sense to me. Um, So yeah, having that secondary character, and then also sometimes having those secondary characters use some of the clues that you don't feel like you can use, like Alverne said, having them come up with something then makes them like it's good satisfaction for that secondary character, and then it also helps your protagonist, work through that clue that they couldn't have gotten on their own. So that's another one that I love to do with mine.
I agree. The secondary characters can be your point of view for the audience. But there's also different kinds of clues. There's the clues that are in the description. You see the candlestick, or you see the loose brick, or so those are one type of clue. But then we've also got the clues of a character says something that, oh, that seems weird, but two or three chapters later, something clicks to what they said. So there's a lot of different types of clues we can leave. You know, is there history? Has this sort of thing happened before? You know, if you're writing a Sherlock Holmes thing, Holmes has had multiple adventures and solved multiple mysteries. So he's bringing a history of, oh, this reminds me of the time, and you can lay clues that way, or put ideas in the reader's head to point them in the direction you want to go. And so there's multiple ways we can lay those in. And but I like using the characters, but the characters have to see clues to react to them.
A few of you mentioned, changing things around based on your evaluation of breadcrumbs, and I'm curious if either you have had a change in ending completely, or something in the breadcrumbs had a change, and how you went about something like that. Because I think we talked about revision being really important for this, and I think for some of our listeners, it may seem very daunting to tackle something like that. So if you have any tips for doing that on your end.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I've written that's related to the book that is pictured here, I had originally sort of plotted out part of the ending in one direction, and then I realized that there was sort of a gap there. And so what I ended up doing is taking one of the characters from earlier. What I write is primarily with this series, they're superhero related mysteries and set in an alternate 1950s. And so I had this character that I had introduced earlier as just sort of a side character that was a lot of fun. And then I'm like, I needed another superhero to show up. And I was like, that guy could be a superhero. There's nothing stopping it. And so basically, by bringing in that extra character, I was able to accomplish what I was trying to do in a way that made more sense. And so then that helped me to get to the ending that I had planned. So it wasn't so much that I changed the ending, it was that I changed a step in the process in order to make the ending work the way I wanted.
Yeah, I would say for my current novel, I knew what the bad guy or the villain was, and what I didn't know was the motivation behind it, and it occurred, I think, somewhere midway in the book where, again, like Bobby said, a character, a piece of dialogue was said, and when that character said it, it set everything in motion for how the ending would come about, and I think two-thirds of the way through, as I was writing the thing, I realized I knew what the character's motivation now for the crime was, but I needed a conduit, and I realized I had to bring in a new character, who became the conduit for why the villain, goes out and exercises the crime because you know. But before that, I was like, oh, he's just doing it. But I'm like, why it doesn't it in real life it doesn't work that way. Like, why would he risk it all for this? And so in that moment of dialogue, I was like, oh, okay, I can still keep everything. I just got to introduce this new character. But now I'm like, okay, when do I show him? How do I show him? And that became a thing of like, oh, well, you got to write a chapter at least to show this character exists. Doesn't have to be in there anything more than a chapter, but that chapter has to bring everybody into the same room for one reason or another. And if you die, and if I hadn't wrote that chapter, rest of the book would have made sense. So by the ending, it was like, oh yeah, the villain did this, but it would have made no sense whatsoever without that character who became the conduit or the employer for everything else that was happening.
Oh, absolutely. I've done that as well, where characters or like there was one novel where we had spent so much time with the main characters that I was like, I need a break from them. But I knew some other stuff was going to happen. And so I know there's just one character that's going to do something that's going to get them killed, and that's going to take this. But I felt I needed to set them up. So I wrote this whole chapter that introduces a new character who interacts with the character that I know is going to die. And, and as I'm writing it, I'm like, well, if this doesn't work, I'll just pull it out of the book. But I write this chapter. I like the chapter. I write it. It goes well. I go back to the next chapter, keep going with the main characters. 2 chapters later, I realized who that guy was and how he interacted with the main story. But I didn't know it when I wrote it, or at least I didn't consciously, subconsciously. Obviously, we do. But again, that's where I always say the trust the characters part, because had I not done that, it may have the outcome of the book might have been different, because that character's introduction has a big effect on one of the main characters 2 chapters later. And so things like that happen. But as we've all said here, that it's got to make sense. And that's sometimes the hardest thing is, does it make sense? It makes sense to me. Does it make sense to other people? Is because there's when you're writing mysteries, there's all kind of tropes to fall into. People that have read a lot of mysteries pick up on those. They know them. I mean, we probably all do it when we read mysteries or watch a mystery on TV, or oh, I know what that means. That means. So the trick is finding a way to do it to still be entertaining, to still keep your reader engaged, because you don't want your reader getting bored and going, oh, I know what he's doing. I've read this book before. I've read this story. So those are the hard parts. And so sometimes, yeah, having those new characters come in, or throwing a twist. We're talking about breadcrumbs. Twists are a big part of mysteries as well, but twists have to make sense as well. So you really have to breadcrumb those as well, because if twists come out of nowhere, people just go, you know, it's got to be one of those things where hopefully when the twist happens, the reader goes, oh, and they can start going back through the story. Hopefully, maybe they want to read it again, but if nothing else, they know that's what these things were for. And so, but those are, yeah, they're tough to do, and you have to make them make sense. And it's not always easy. And sometimes they don't even feel like they make sense to me sometimes. And then till I get to a certain point and I realize, oh, okay, this character was doing something I hadn't realized they were doing. And then that adds a layer. And that also helps with your red herrings too, because this character is doing something that makes them look guilty, but they're not really guilty. Maybe they're guilty of something else, or maybe they're, yes, they're not the murderer, but they're embezzling from the company. So that's why they're being sketchy and they're hiding something. So that kind of stuff. So you can do all that stuff and keep your reader kind of going in multiple directions. But the real trick for us is we all have to make it tie in at the end and make sense. You don't want those, even your red herring breadcrumbs have to go somewhere. You don't want to get to the end of it and go, well, guy, we never did fall, So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that's where mapping it out comes in handy. And I know probably with Dawn with outlining it, when doing mysteries, I wish I could outline. I suck at it. I am terrible at outlining. So I have to do it in a different way. So when I start, I know my characters first, and then it's like, okay, here's plot points I know we have to hit. And so the first plot point is, okay, there's a murder or a theft or whatever the mystery is. Plot point number one is we got to get there. And so then I tell my characters, how do we go there? And then I follow the characters, because the character of Tom Myers, who's in this book, might go about it one way. My character Snow from another book series might approach solving a problem a different way. And so that's where we tell stories that are uniquely us, because all of us write our characters and we know our characters, and So we could each drop, like the four of us could each drop our characters in the exact same like simple plot, and you're going to get four different stories because the characters are different, the writers are different, and that's what makes our stories uniquely us. So even if you're telling a story where someone recognizes, oh, I've seen this plot. Yes, you've seen this plot, but you've not seen this plot with this character. And that's where you get the uniqueness. Putting it in TV terms, like watching a regular detective, like watching Law and Order versus watching Columbo. They're solving the same type of problems, but they're doing them in drastically different ways. And that's what keeps the people coming back. It's not always the mystery. They love the characters. And so they want to solve the mystery with that character. And so that's kind of that's how I approach it. It's more the character than the mystery. The mystery is important, but to me, the character is more important than the mystery. Boy, that was a long-winded answer. Sorry.
Sorry, I was actually going to say, in some ways, Bobby, I think you do outline, but you don't maybe do the formal outline. And I think that it makes sense. You have the steps, but you don't have all the details filled in. And in some ways, that is still a type of outline. And I suspect also, I'm curious about this, after you've written it, do you ever go back and reverse outline where you then look at what you've written and figure out what the outline would have been so that you can then revise better?
Maybe in my head, I don't write it down. Maybe that's well, I should say. I can't write a plot out. Like if I write out an outline, like a full outline, what happens with me is when I then go to write the story, I'm ready to move on because I feel like I've already wrote that story. So so it's not that I don't plot. Yeah, I just don't go through the here's every detail of every, I have one friend who his outlines are so in depth that sometimes they're longer than the book. So that when he goes and starts writing, but he can go through his final draft really quick because he's put in all the work up front. And I can't make my brain do that. So yeah, so most of mine works out in I know these steps have to happen, and then the rest of it's in my head. Like it's not written down, but it's running around, in my brain. The characters are whispering, I want to do this, I want to do that. So yeah, so you're right. It's yeah. So I'm not I'm not a full pantser or anything. I do have a good notion of what's going to happen in the book. I generally know the ending. I know most of the time I know who the villain is. There have been a couple times where through the course of it, I've adjusted, but I kind of know where we're going. I know who the bad guy is. I know what the plan is. So we're at least rowing in the right direction. But yeah, I just don't write it down. So I guess maybe that's the difference.
So to switch gears a little bit, I'm wondering if you all have examples that you can think of from either novel, short stories, or even media like shows and movies we've mentioned, where you do think breadcrumbing was done really well.
I've got one that's my definite go-to, and this is an author who writes YA historical Korean novels. Her name's June Her, and the most recent one that she's put out, A Crane Among Wolves, has some of the best breadcrumbing that I've seen. There's not to give too much away, but there is a character that you don't think you need to keep your eyes on, and turns out you did need to keep your eyes on that one. So yeah, it was a really effective way, and there was just little things here and there that when you get to the sort of who done it and the why, you're all of a sudden everything that led up to it makes sense, and it's really really satisfying. And I recommend all of her books, but A Crane Among Wolves currently is just like my top, like, I am so amazed how well she did that.
Oh, cool. I'll have to look that up. I've not heard of that one. I'll have to look that one up. Yeah, there are a lot. I mean, if you go back to the classics, I mean, Agatha Christie was excellent at leaving crumbs and red herrings and taking you. So certainly the Sherlock Holmes books or anything like that. As a kid, I was a big fan of the Encyclopedia Brown stuff, which was full of those little different types of, child friendly breadcrumbs. But I learned things that stick with me to this day that I remember there. But in terms of movies, an excellent movie in terms of doing that is The Usual Suspects, because that is all breadcrumbs and red herrings throughout the entire movie. And when you get to the end and it's revealed what happened, you want to then go back and watch it again to see if you could pick up. And I love that. It's such a well manufactured movie. So yeah, those are that I would suggest.
Yeah, I totally agree on all those. I would think also one of my favorites, I guess, in the last some years of a great detective, and I guess in the TV medium has been Monk. Um, the first episode, the pilot alone, is is just laced with a lot of breadcrumbs and a lot of red herrings. But I think they do a great job of keeping you engaged in the mystery. And then when I think in the pilot, when it's revealed who the bad guy is, you see it, but you don't see it. And then you're like, oh, how did I not see that? It was right there in my face all the time. I think there's just so many things that does it well. Like Knives Out was such a great whodunit. And I think even the latest one that he did, the Glass Onion, in so many ways was just like it's just played on that, who done it, but more so why. It always comes down to the why. So I think there's just so many different mediums that do it well, and so many different authors for so many different reasons do it well. That is it's hard. It's like one of my one of my all time favorites, and I think it's because I played the game as a kid. But it's Clue. Clue does it. The movie, I love the original movie. If you can go watch it, because there's six different endings of how, or six or seven different endings how it could end, and then you go back and you try to see if the breadcrumbs match the ending. And you're going, oh yeah, they do match. So I think just playing the game Clue just helps you kind of breadcrumb if you're looking to be a writer and that's something you want to do. Play the game Clue and play it for a few hours. After a while, you'll figure out like every different way you could do a murder.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Knives Out and The Glass Onion because those were two that I was just thinking, yeah, those. And then also what Bobby said about Encyclopedia Brown, it occurred to me that as a child, I read Encyclopedia Brown, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Bobbsey Twins. I wonder why I ended up a mystery writer, you know?
And Scooby Doo,
Yes.
Scooby Doo on TV. Yeah. Mentioning Monk, Monk is one of those great examples of what we were talking about earlier because of the way Monk's brain works. Having a good side character is very important because Monk wouldn't be telling all of this stuff if he didn't have that person to explain what he's doing. But they also do a great thing at the end where he'll do this. Every episode has a here's what happened. And then he explains how the crime was committed, and we get to see how his brain put all that together. So that one's a really good example of showing your work basically. Whereas some procedurals you'll watch on TV and then say, oh, well, we found the gun in your apartment that we were searching while we were questioning you. And I'm like, I didn't have that information. As a viewer, I didn't know that. And so I like those shows that really explain it. They tell it. We see it, not just, oh, we know you did it. No, and I think that's why we talked about Columbo. I think Columbo works so well because we know who did it, but seeing how he figures it out, watching him not only do that, but then do it in a way that makes them screw themselves because he convinces them to confess. That's brilliant writing. I wish I could write some of these things this well. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of detective fiction.
I'm also finding it's really interesting when we're talking about these specific protagonists, how many of them I would say are probably neurodiverse. And it's interesting to like have it be a neurodiverse character who uses that neurodiversity to solve the mysteries but then needs someone who is non-neurodivergent to sort of be the helper to have everything explained to them. I think that's true of Sherlock. I think that's true of Monk and just so many of these detective characters who use their neurodivergence to solve things, but then also can't entirely explain it without a character that gets it explained to them.
And that makes it great too, because it explains how that uniquely helps them solve the mysteries, because they walk into the same room with all these other detectives and they see something that the other detectives aren't even looking for. So I think it, in terms of it's giving them a leg up in some cases, this either the neurodivergent or the quirkiness, or however you want to refer to it, it gives them an edge. It also makes them more fun to watch, because half of the fun of Monk is watching the quirky whatever he's going through that week. He's afraid of bugs this week, or he's afraid, uh, half the fun is watching that and then seeing them. It's not a liability. They overcome something. You know, he overcomes a fear of flying to stop a guy who's trying to get away on an airplane. That kind of thing. And so so they're wonderful character bits in addition to solving the mystery. And yeah, absolutely great examples.
We've talked about endings and characters, and so I'm curious for all of you, when you approach your mysteries, is there something that you know first, right? Is it you know the ending first, or you have a character you write around? Because I know different writers start somewhere else, and I just don't know if for you, does it change with mysteries?
Start. For me, I always know the ending. Almost everything I write, I always know the ending. I'll know the ending and usually sometimes the beginning, but through the course of writing, the ending will stay the same, but it'll somehow change. The villain will still be there, but how, like, for instance, in Blue Religion, the novel that we're talking about, the ending stayed the same, but then at some point I felt like I needed I needed a prelude or something to kind of wrap everything up. And when I originally started writing this, none of that existed. It just or I knew, and because this certain story was inspired by a true crime. I knew the crime, but I didn't know any of the, because this is an unsolved crime. So it was literally me putting all the puzzle pieces together and trying to make sense of it. And as Bobby said, it came out of the idea that I'm from Chicago and it's such a Chicago crime that I'm like, it couldn't be done any other way. And then as you start to put the puzzle pieces together, what I started realizing was that when I mean by Chicago crime, I would think about Capone, Dillinger, and all these other, like, otherworldly high crime figures that have been part of Chicago history, and you started to see, like, oh, there's a pattern to these things over the years, that no matter what, it's a Chicago crime, in the how it was done, where it was done, that kind of thing, and you started to realize, oh, I know I know this part of this world, the Chicago part, but then you don't realize that, oh yeah, these ending has to be justified now of of the environment. You know what I mean? So now your character lives in this environment, and as the readers, you've come into this environment, and now you have to justify and explain to other readers who may not be from this environment why these things are particularly, why they make sense and why they're important to this particular story. And that's something I didn't realize until I was writing the thing. But I usually almost always know some type or some form of the ending that I want to get to.
I'm actually the opposite, and I start with knowing what the crime is, in the sense of, like, I have the sort of big moment of the reveal of the crime. So, for example, in one book, it was a boat exploding. In this book, it was arriving in the main character's hometown and discovering that her best childhood friend had been murdered. Um, and then once I've got that, I sort of go, okay, who would have done this and why would they have done it? And with this book in particular, it was interesting because I said, okay, I've got the what and I've got the who, but I'm trying to figure out the why. And my husband, just as a complete one-off, said, she knows where the bodies are buried. And that was the thing that made me go, okay, now I have the why. And so then I could piece it all together. So yeah, I think that those are like the three elements, is the who, the what, and the why. And I tend to start with the what and then maybe the who and then figure out the why.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I have a few different series that run. Um, I write for other publishers, but the stuff that I do myself, I tend to do as novellas. So, like this book here, this collects 3 novellas. That's the collected version. So I write these novellas, and so I have a multiple series going. So I'll get an idea for a crime or a villain, or we've discovered something. Then it becomes, okay, which character is that story for? Because if it's a Sheriff Myers story, it's not a Snow story. It's different depending on who. And so sometimes, like, the idea for the first story in this book, uh, my very first novel, this character was like a third tertiary character. He was in it, but he wasn't the star. And the character just stayed with me and kept, like, in the back of my mind going, when do I get my own story? And it took a while. It took many years before I got an idea for a story where it clicked. Wait, that's his story. That's his problem to solve. And so once I had those two things, I had the idea, the plot, the basic problem, and going from there and then putting him to it, then that helped the rest of it start to fall into place. Why is he involved? Why is this happening in his small town? Like Alverne mentioned, Chicago. This takes place in a small town. If I'd have set this in with another character in one of the bigger cities, it's a different story because of just what's going on. And so once you figure all that out, then I can say, okay, I know which character is solving this problem. Then I go to that character and say, let's solve this problem. What would be your first step? And because I've gotten to know my characters, that will then inform the way that character goes about solving that problem, solving that mystery. And that's usually where I start. And then I've plot, like I said earlier, I've got a loose plot. I know who the bad guy is. I know I know how we're going to go. I know where we're going to go. It's just in the matter of filling in all the middle parts of how we get there. And so that's usually how I start.
Do you all think there are any misconceptions or misunderstandings about writing mystery? And if so, how would you correct them for newer writers?
I've talked to a lot of people that think it's easy.
I was gonna
Oh,
say that.
I've
Go,
read
please.
mysteries all my life. I've watched mysteries on TV. How hard can it be? Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, we all have different degrees of difficulty in writing, but writing a mystery, there's an extra level of the clues and the breadcrumbs and making it make sense, and that I don't have when I write other genres. And so, yeah, so I get that one a lot, that it's easy.
I think the one that I have is that you don't have to know it all when you start. I mean, I think we've all sort of talked about that, about things change as you're drafting, things change as you're revising. And so, like, if you have an idea for a mystery that you want to write, you don't have to get it completely correct on your first draft. You can, it can evolve, it can change. And so, mostly you got to try to write it out and see what you get, and then you can work on improving it and tweaking it. So it can be hard, absolutely, like Bobby said, but at the same time you can play around with it and take your time to get it correct.
Yeah, I think another misconception is that I think people believe or think that mysteries have to have a twist. Like everything has to be an M. Night movie, and it doesn't. And half the time, as Bobby said earlier, the twist, if there is one, it comes out naturally. It occurs because the characters or situation has created the twist. But half the time, when there's a twist in a novel, from a writer, it's not something that we were planning or plotting. It just happened, and you're like, oh my god, that's pretty cool. I think I'll leave that in there, or you're like, I didn't see that coming. And so if I'm surprised as a writer, I'm like, okay, I know the reader's gonna be so surprised too. But usually, I think the misconception is that readers or people that aren't readers when they come into the genre is that every mystery has to have a twist, or every book has to have a twist. And I think when you get to that ending and people close and they go, okay, that's the ending, usually it's, well, what happens next? And it's like, it happened. It already happened. This is the end. And I think sometimes readers, they miss it. And then they'll go back and go, wait, I was expecting something else, or shouldn't there be another chapter or something? And it's like, no, if you go back and you read it, all the clues, everything's tied up nicely. And maybe I left you something in there for the possibility of another book down the road, or, but everything's there. And I think sometimes when reading a mystery, we get that we want to solve it, but once it's solved, we're like, I want the next mystery. I want the next breadcrumb. And you're like, no, that's it. It's just no encore. You'll get another novel somewhere time, but right now I'm done performing.
Yeah, you don't want people to read the twist and go, oh, you want them to go, oh, that was cool. If you're just throwing a twist in to throw it in, readers will get that, and it will not make sense, and they will just be like, oh, And sometimes that will color they could have enjoyed everything up to that, and now, oh, this book was awful because they. So you have to, yeah, like has to make sense. It has to come out of the story or out of the characters and make sense. But yeah, and then if you're doing a series, the mystery is, your next book would be a different mystery. So your characters become important because the readers fall in love with your character. So when they come back for the next book, it's because they want to they want to see those characters do something. And so that's how you get return readers for your new mysteries. And it also helps because I hate to say it, I wish everything I wrote was gold, but sometimes I miss the mark, and I don't, this book didn't land as well as that one, but they still love the characters, so they're willing to come back for the next book when you get back and get you back on track, but because they're still enjoying the characters, even if, like, I didn't land the mystery right.
Yeah, I think another misconception that I think about it is that, at least I think for readers who read crime fiction, and sometimes even if you're coming into it to write it, is that your character has to be brilliantly smart. They have to be the Sherlock Holmes. They can't just be the John McClane, the everyday guy. And I think that's, in some ways, that hurts mysteries, because everybody wants to be the next Sherlock Holmes, and it's okay not to be the Sherlock Holmes. I think it's more prudent. I think that mysteries and mystery writing in general, crime fiction in general, is a reflection of society, and it becomes a sounding board for what's going on in the world, or in that character's world, or even in our world. And I think when we are writing, when we're not reflecting back to the reader, if they can't see themselves or see the world that they're in, then I think, or a world that they want to be in, then I think that's when we lose our audience, because now they're expecting, like Adrian Monk is really brilliant, but again, he has this neural thing that makes him. He's the Sherlock Holmes of San Francisco, but you take him out into the world, and he becomes, this baby character. Whereas, as we know, Sherlock Holmes can travel the world, but he's got to do his, whatever he does to sustain his opium or whatever. So we all have these character flaws. And I think as we progress, sometimes people believe that every character has to be brilliantly smart, or that can't occur.
One of the things that I've heard of advice in relation to that is that your character does not have to be the best at what they do. They just have to be the best person to solve that mystery. And so, your character absolutely should have flaws, and those flaws can impede them solving things, but there's also some positive trait about them that makes them perfect for what they're doing. And so that's sort of always my thing is yes, I want to have my characters encounter things that they can't do, but they have what they need to do their main purpose in that story.
Yeah, and having written Sherlock Holmes once before, I am not smart enough to think like Sherlock Holmes. You know, so there's also that I can't write character. It's harder to write characters that know stuff I don't know. Um, research helps, but I am not that guy. I am not that guy that walks into a room and immediately spots every clue. I'm so yeah. So sometimes we have to kind of like, how do you write a character that's smarter than I am? Research and things like that help. But yeah, it's not always easy.
All right, thank you all for the conversation today. There are definitely a lot of tips and tricks I'll be taking home for my stories. So to end, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to maybe dispense any other tips or wisdom you have for our audience, but also to plug yourself and your work and to let our audience know where they may find your stuff.
I'll go first. So I think my biggest tip is just write. um, Ray Bradbury had this quote they used to say that you jump off a cliff and you build your wings on the way down. And I sometimes go to that as the quote that I think about sometimes when I'm like, oh, I can't write this. And I'm like, you know what? Just try it. And my other one would come from the writer Joe Mino. He says the difference between him and the next writer is that he finishes. And so my biggest thing is always just finish a draft. I know so many writers that write and don't finish a draft. And for me, that's my biggest pet peeve. Just finish it. Even if it's not great, just finish it. Because then that means you're one step closer to being a better writer than you were when you first started. So that would be my advice. And I would say that you can find any of my books anywhere in the world, as long as there's a bookseller, especially if you go to your mom and pop bookstores and request my books under my name, Alverne Ball. Or if you ever want to find me online, my new website just went live a couple days ago. It's alvernewrites.com. So that's me.
I'll go ahead and go next. You can find, or sorry, first off, advice. I would absolutely agree with what Alverne just said. You can always fix something that you've written, but you can't edit something that's not done. Because you have to get it done in order to then be able to say, okay, now what do I need to do? So finish and then edit and just keep writing and just keep learning is also very important. You can find all of my books at my website, which is historythatneverwas.com. And the book here is the latest novella that I've put out, Sure Shot in Cobalt City, Homecoming. It is a standalone sequel to a previous Sure Shot book. There's basically just the detective, who is also a superhero, goes around to different locations and solve things. And yeah, it's alternate 1950s, superhero mystery, and the protagonist is a lesbian, and many of the other supporting characters are also queer, depending on which of the novellas you pick up. And then anything that I've written that is novella or longer is probably a mystery of some sort, not always with a detective protagonist, sometimes with somebody who just has to solve the mystery because otherwise something bad will happen.
Yeah, I advice, have fun. I mean, write what you enjoy. Try not to, if you enjoy writing mysteries, great, write mysteries. If you don't enjoy writing mysteries, if you try to write mysteries, you're probably going to make yourself miserable. So yeah, do what you enjoy, and that way you'll find writing is so much easier on you too when you're enjoying what you do. BobbyNash.com is my website. There's links to everything. I have books in Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, blah, 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 mom and pop stores. I have a store on my site. They're everywhere. They're not hard to find. Please, and I'm all over social media. Please stop by and say hello.
All right, thank you all, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. There are many more sessions in this year's Write Hive conference, so I recommend you take a peek at the schedule and check out some of the other programming. Happy writing.